Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the small, fog-drenched village of Blackthorn, time seemed to move differently. The streets were narrow and winding, the houses old and crooked, and the air was always filled with the faint ticking of clocks. At the heart of the village stood the clockmaker's shop, a tall, narrow building with a sign that read Ezekiel Grayson, Master Clockmaker. The shop was a place of wonder and mystery, filled with clocks of every shape and size, each one more intricate and beautiful than the last. Ezekiel Grayson was a man of few words, with a stern face and piercing gray eyes. He was known throughout the village as a genius, a man who could fix any clock, no matter how broken or ancient. But he was also a man of secrets, and few knew much about his past or how he had come to possess such extraordinary skill. For as long as he could remember, Thomas had been fascinated by clocks. He loved the way they ticked and talked, the way their gears and springs worked together in perfect harmony. He had always dreamed of becoming a clockmaker, and when he turned 16, he finally got his chance. Ezekiel Grayson took him on as an apprentice, and Thomas couldn't have been happier. But as the days turned into weeks, Thomas began to notice something strange about the shop. The clocks didn't just tell time, they seemed to have a life of their own. Some of them would chime at odd hours, their melodies haunting and beautiful. Others would stop and start on their own, as if they were trying to communicate something. And then there were the clocks that Ezekiel kept locked away in a back room, clocks that Thomas was forbidden to touch. Thomas tried to ignore the strange occurrences, focusing on his work and learning everything he could from Ezekiel. But the more time he spent in the shop, the more he felt that something was off. The air was always heavy with a sense of unease, and he often felt as if he was being watched. One night, as Thomas was closing up the shop, he heard a faint ticking coming from the back room. He had never been inside the room, but his curiosity got the better of him. He took the key from Ezekiel's desk and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The room was small and dimly lit, with shelves lining the walls. On the shelves were clocks unlike any Thomas had ever seen. They were old and ornate, with faces that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. The ticking was louder here, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound that seemed to fill the room. Thomas approached one of the clocks, a large brass timepiece with intricate engravings. As he reached out to touch it, he felt a sudden surge of energy, and the room was filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, Thomas found himself standing in a different place. The room was gone, replaced by a vast, endless landscape of gears and cogs, all moving in perfect synchronization. The air was filled with the sound of ticking, a symphony of time that seemed to echo through the very fabric of reality. Thomas felt a surge of awe and fear. He had no idea where he was, but he knew that he had crossed into a different realm, a place where time itself was alive. As he explored the landscape, he noticed that the gears and cogs were not just moving on their own, they were being guided by shadowy figures, their forms shifting and changing as they worked. Thomas realized that these were the clockmakers, the beings who controlled the flow of time. One of the figures approached him, its form solidifying into that of an old man with a long white beard and kind eyes. "Thomas," the man said, his voice soft and melodic, "you have come far, but you must be careful. This is not a place for the living." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are you? What is this place?" The man smiled. "I am one of the keepers of time, and this is the clockwork realm. It is a place where time is woven, where the past, present, and future are all connected. But it is also a dangerous place, and those who enter must be prepared to face the consequences." Thomas felt a surge of panic. "I didn't mean to come here, I just wanted to see the clocks." The keeper nodded. "Curiosity is a powerful force, but it can also be a dangerous one. You must return to your world before it's too late." Thomas nodded, but as he turned to leave, he noticed something strange. The gears and cogs around him were beginning to slow, their movements becoming sluggish and uneven. The ticking grew louder, more frantic, and the air was filled with a sense of dread. "What's happening?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. The keeper's expression grew grave. "The balance of time is being disrupted. Someone is tampering with the clocks in your world, and it is causing chaos here. You must stop them before it's too late." Thomas felt a surge of determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." The keeper nodded. "Then go, and be quick. Time is running out." With that, the keeper waved his hand, and Thomas was enveloped in a blinding light. When the light faded, he was back in the back room of the shop, the ticking of the clocks loud and frantic. Thomas knew that he had to act fast. He ran out of the room and into the main shop, where he found Ezekiel standing by the counter, his face pale and drawn. "Ezekiel, what's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with urgency. Ezekiel turned to him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. "I tried to stop it, Thomas. I tried to fix it, but it's too late. The clocks, they're alive. They're trying to take control." Thomas felt a surge of panic. "What do you mean? What did you do?" Ezekiel shook his head. "I thought I could control them, that I could use them to bend time to my will, but I was wrong. They're too powerful, and now they're trying to break free." Thomas felt a surge of anger. "You fool, you've put us all in danger." Ezekiel looked down, his face filled with shame. "I know, but there's still a chance to stop them. You have to destroy the clocks, Thomas. You have to break the connection." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure how he was going to accomplish such a task, but he knew he had to try. He grabbed a hammer from the workbench and ran back to the back room where the clocks were ticking louder and louder, their movements becoming more erratic. He approached the first clock, a small silver timepiece with a delicate face. He raised the hammer and brought it down, shattering the clock into pieces. The ticking grew louder, more frantic, but Thomas didn't stop. He moved to the next clock and the next, smashing them one by one. As he destroyed each clock, he felt a surge of energy, as if he was breaking a connection, severing the link between the clocks in the clockwork realm. The ticking grew softer, more subdued, and the air was filled with a sense of relief. Finally, there was only one clock left, the large brass timepiece that had brought him to the clockwork realm. Thomas hesitated, but only for a moment. He raised the hammer and brought it down, shattering the clock into pieces. The room was filled with a deafening silence, and then slowly the ticking began to fade. The clocks were still, their movements stopped, and the air was heavy with a sense of finality. Thomas felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had done it. He had stopped the clocks and saved the village from whatever chaos they would have brought. But as he looked around the room, he knew that he would never be the same. The experience had changed him, and he would carry the knowledge of the clockwork realm with him for the rest of his life. Ezekiel appeared in the doorway, his face filled with relief. "You did it, Thomas. You saved us." Thomas nodded, though he felt no sense of triumph. "It's over, but at what cost? The clocks are gone, and with them the connection to the clockwork realm." Ezekiel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes we must lose something to gain something greater. The clocks were a danger, and now they are gone. The village is safe, and that is what matters." Thomas nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling of loss. He had always loved clocks, and now they were gone, their beauty and mystery lost forever. But as he left the shop and stepped out into the village, he felt a sense of peace. The air was clear, and the ticking of the clocks was gone, replaced by the sounds of the village coming to life. And deep within the clockwork realm, the keepers of time watched, their forms shifting and changing as they worked to restore the balance of time. They knew that the connection had been severed, but they also knew that it was for the best. The clockwork realm was a place of wonder and danger, and it was not meant for the living. But as they worked, they couldn't help but wonder if Thomas would ever return, if he would ever be drawn back to the realm of time and clocks. And deep within the village of Blackthorn, the clockmaker's shop stood silent and still, its secrets hidden away, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover them. In the heart of the city, hidden behind an unmarked door in an alley that smelled of damp concrete and forgotten dreams, there was a place where the wealthy and powerful gathered. It was not a place one could find on a map or through an invitation. You had to know it existed, and even then you had to be deemed worthy to enter. It was called the Silent Auction, and it was not like any auction house you had ever heard of. The rules were simple: no names, no faces, no question. The bidders wore masks, elegant, grotesque, or utterly plain, to conceal their identities. The items up for bid were never displayed. Instead, they were described in cryptic, tantalizing terms by a faceless auctioneer who stood at the front of the room, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. But the most important rule was this: once you placed a bid, there was no backing out. The price you paid was not always money. Sometimes it was something far more valuable. Elliot Graves had heard whispers of the silent auction for years. He was a man who prided himself on knowing the city's secrets, on having access to things others could only dream of. But this was different. This was the kind of secret that could ruin a person or elevate them to unimaginable heights, and Elliot was willing to risk it. He had been given a single clue: find the door with no handle and knock 3 times. It had taken him weeks to locate it, but when he did, he felt a thrill of anticipation. The door was unremarkable, tucked into the side of an old brick building that looked like it hadn't been occupied in decades. He knocked 3 times, and the door swung open on silent hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and something else, something metallic like blood. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with velvet curtains that seemed to absorb the light. A dozen or so people sat in high-backed chairs, their faces faces obscured by masks. Elliot was handed a plain black mask and gestured to an empty seat. He sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. The auctioneer stepped forward, his face hidden in shadow. He began to speak, his voice low and smooth like the purr of a cat. "Our first item tonight," he said, "is a rare opportunity. A chance to undo a single regret, to go back and make a different choice. The bidding starts at 1 year. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. A year? What did that mean? He glanced around the room, but the other bidders were impassive, their masks giving nothing away. One of them raised a hand and the auctioneer nodded. 1 year, he said. Do I hear 2? Another hand went up. 2 years. Do I hear 3? Elliot's mind raced. He had regrets, who didn't? But was this real? Could it be real? Before he could stop himself, he raised his hand. 3 years, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 4? The bidding continued, climbing higher till it reached 10 years. The room fell silent and the auctioneer turned to Elliot. 10 years, he said. Sold. Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. What had he just agreed to? He wanted to ask, but the rules were clear, no questions. He was led to a small curtained alcove where a contract waited on a table. The terms were written in elegant script, but the language was vague. He hesitated, but the thrill of the unknown was too much to resist. He signed the contract. The auctioneer handed him a small ornate key. Use it wisely, he said. The key was cold in Elliot's hand as he left the auction house. He had no idea what it unlocked or how it would help him undo a regret. But as he walked through the city, his mind began to wander. He thought about the choices he had made, the paths he hadn't taken, and then it hit him. The key was for his childhood home. He hadn't been back in years, not since his mother's death. She had begged him to visit her in the hospital, but he had been too busy, too caught up in his own life. By the time he finally went, it was too late. She was gone. Elliot's hands trembled as he inserted the key into the lock of his old front door. It turned with a soft click and the door swung open. Inside, the house was exactly as he remembered it. The faded wallpaper, the worn furniture, the faint scent of his mother's perfume. And there, sitting in her favorite chair, was his mother. She looked just as she had the last time he had seen her, her face lined with age, but her eyes bright and full of life. She smiled when she saw him, and for a moment Elliot felt a surge of joy. But then he noticed something strange. The room was silent, completely silent. No ticking clock, no creaking floorboards, no sound of his own breathing. It was as if the world had been muted. Elliot, his mother said, her voice soft and distant. You came back. He wanted to respond, to tell her how sorry he was, but the words wouldn't come. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, sluggish. And then he noticed something else. His hands were wrinkled, the skin thin and papery. He looked down at himself and saw that his clothes were loose, hanging off a frame that had grown frail with age. He stumbled to a mirror on the wall and gasped. The face staring back at him was his own, but older, much older. His hair was gray, his face lined with deep wrinkles. He looked like a man in his 70s, not the 40-year-old he had been just moments ago. What happened? He croaked, his voice weak and raspy. His mother's smile faded. You paid the price, she said. 10 years, Elliot. That's what it cost to see me again. Elliot's heart sank. He had thought the auctioneer meant 10 years of his life in some abstract sense, not literally. He had traded a decade of his life for this, for a few moments with a ghost. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. His mother reached out and took his hand. Her touch was cold like ice. It's too late for apologies, she said. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. The room began to fade, the walls dissolving into darkness. Elliot tried to hold on, but the world slipped away from him. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the auction house, sitting in the same chair as before. The auctioneer was speaking, his voice low and hypnotic. Our next item, he said, is a chance to relive your happiest memory. The bidding starts at 5 years. Elliot's hands trembled as he raised them to his face. His skin was smooth, unlined. He was young again, but he could still feel the weight of those lost years, the emptiness they had left behind. He stood up and walked out of the auction house, the whispers of the other bidders following him into the night. He didn't look back. He knew better now. The silent auction was not a place for second chances. It was a place for fools who thought they could outsmart fate. And Elliot had learned the hard way that some prices were too high to pay. It started with a rumor. In the town of Harlow, there was an urban legend that nobody took seriously until they saw him for themselves. A man, not a ghost, not a monster, just an ordinary-looking man, dressed in a gray coat, wearing old leather shoes, hands tucked into his pockets. And he was always walking, always in a perfect circle.
The first sighting, Maggie Farrell was the first to report him. She worked at a small gas station just off the highway, working late shifts when the roads were mostly empty. One night, at around 2:14 a.m., she saw him through the security cameras. A man walking in a slow, steady circle near the pumps. Not pacing, not wandering, just walking, perfectly. He didn't look drunk, lost, or injured. Just deliberate, step after step, following the same invisible path like a compass needle locked in place. After a few minutes, Maggie stepped outside and called out to him, "Sir? Are you okay?" No response. He didn't look at her, didn't stop, didn't even hesitate. He just kept walking. Maggie frowned. "Sir, do you need help?" Nothing. She took a step closer. As she did, something changed. The air around her felt wrong, like she had stepped into a freezer, but only in that one spot. A sharp chill wrapped around her, biting into her arms, numbing her fingertips. And then she saw it. His footprints. They weren't disappearing. The pavement was dry, but his footprints stayed. A perfect loop of damp, dark imprints circling the same patch of concrete. Maggie's stomach twisted. She ran back inside, locked the doors, and didn't look outside again until sunrise. By morning, he was gone, but the footprints were still there. More sightings. He wasn't seen every night. Sometimes he wouldn't appear for weeks. Then out of nowhere someone would spot him, always in different places, gas stations, parking lots, abandoned roads, but always walking, always in a circle. One night a group of teenagers tried to mess with him. They threw rocks, sticks, even a can of beer. Nothing hit him, not because he dodged, because the objects never landed. The can of beer arced through the air, heading straight for his head, then vanished, gone, like it had been swallowed mid-flight. The teens ran. No one tried to touch him again. The breaking point. Sam Holt was a trucker passing through Harlow when he saw the man. It was nearly 3 a.m. He was parked at a rest stop, stretching his legs when he spotted him near the empty lot, walking, circling. Sam had heard the rumors, but he wasn't the kind to scare easy. He had been on the road too long to believe in ghost stories, so out of sheer curiosity, he stepped forward, closer than anyone else ever had. At 5 feet away, the air dropped. Freezing, silent, his own breath didn't make a sound. Then the man stopped, mid-step, his foot hovered above the ground, frozen in place, and then slowly, he turned his head. Sam's stomach dropped, because the man had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. Yet Sam knew he was looking at him, watching. Something inside Sam's brain screamed at him to run. He turned, but his legs didn't move, his breath hitched, his muscles locked. He was stuck. The man in the gray coat tilted his head, and then he stepped toward Sam, not in a circle, straight toward him. The footprints he had left behind vanished. The air around them cracked, like reality itself was splintering. Sam finally broke free. He didn't remember running, only that one moment he was frozen. And the next he was sprinting to his truck, slamming the door shut, turning the key with shaking hands. His headlights flickered. For a brief second, he saw the man standing inches from the windshield. No face, no expression, just watching. And then the lights went out. When they flickered back on, the man was gone. What is he? Nobody knows. No one has ever seen him stop. No one knows what happens when he breaks the circle. Because when he does, you don't get to tell the story. All they know is this. If you ever see a man in a gray coat walking, circling, don't get too close, and never let him turn toward you. Because if he does, you'll never walk in a straight line again. The expiration date 1. It started with a carton of milk. I don't even drink milk. But there it was, sitting in my fridge, an unfamiliar brand with a simple white label. It wasn't there the night before. I frowned, picking it up. The expiration date read, July 25th, 03. That was today. Weird. Maybe my roommate bought it. I shrugged and put it back. But when I closed the fridge, my stomach twisted, because every single item inside, every carton, bottle, jar, even my leftover takeout container, had the same expiration date, July 25th, 03. Today, I slammed the fridge shut. 2. I convinced myself it was some dumb prank. Maybe my roommate thought it would be funny. But the longer I stared at those dates, the more a sinking feeling settled in my gut. Just to be safe, I checked the pantry. The cans of soup, July 25th, 03. The cereal, July 25th, 03. Even the damn salt had an expiration date now, July 25th, 03. That's not normal. Salt doesn't expire. Something was very, very wrong. 3. I needed to get out of the apartment. I grabbed my phone and keys, but when I reached for the door, I froze. There, on my doorframe, in small red ink, were 3 words I had never seen before. Expiration date, July 25th, 03. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around wildly. I hadn't written that. My roommate wouldn't do something like this. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but when I checked the lock screen, the date at the top read August 25th, 03. Tomorrow, 4. I don't remember opening the door. I just remember running. Outside, the world looked normal. People were walking their dogs, going about their day, completely unaware that my entire existence had apparently been stamped with an expiration date. I stopped at a corner store and rushed inside. The cashier looked up as I grabbed a random bottle of water and flipped it over. Expiration date, July 25th, 03. I dropped it. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. Hey, you okay? The cashier asked. I turned to him, panicked. I gestured at the bottle, unable to form words. His brows knit together. Dude, you all right? I hesitated. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe this was some kind of fever dream. Then the cashier turned slightly, reaching for something behind the counter, and I saw it, a small red stamp on his neck. Expiration date, July 25th, 03. My stomach twisted.
I took a step back. Never mind. I need to go. I turned and bolted. 5. I ran home, locking the door behind me. This had to be a mistake, a joke, a psychotic break, something. I opened my phone, shaking, looked up my roommate's contact. The last message he sent was last night. Be back late, don't wait up. I hesitated, typed out a message. Where are you? Sent. No response. I tried calling. No answer. I swallowed hard. Maybe he was fine. Maybe I was overreacting. But then I checked the fridge again. Everything was still July 25th, 03, except one item, a small unopened bottle of orange juice. It now read August 25th, 03, tomorrow, 6. I don't know why I picked it up. I turned it over in my hands, staring at the shifting date. Something about it felt off. Then my phone vibrated. I nearly dropped the bottle. A new message from my roommate. Just 2 words. Don't drink. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. A second later, my phone vibrated again. Another message. It's how they reset you. I felt my pulse in my throat. What the hell did that mean? Then, 3 rapid knocks on my door. My breath caught. I turned, staring. Knock. 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 I backed away, slowly. Whoever was outside knocked again. Knock. 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 I didn't move. Then, a voice, low, almost familiar. Your expiration date is up. 7. I don't remember what happened next. Maybe I blacked out. Maybe I ran. Maybe something happened that my mind refuses to remember. All I know is that when I woke up, I was somewhere else. A different apartment, different furniture. I sat up, dizzy. My hands were shaking. My phone buzzed. I picked it up with numb fingers. The date read August 25th, 03. The fridge hummed softly from the kitchen. I stood on unsteady legs, walked toward it, and pulled it open. The milk, the eggs, the water, all of it had a new date. Expiration date, July 25th, 04. A month from now. I stepped back, heart pounding. Then, I turned to the door, and there, printed neatly on the frame, in fresh red ink, expiration date, July 25th, 04. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know where my roommate is. I don't know who or what is keeping track of the date. All I know is that I have 1 month left, and when that time runs out, I don't think I'll get another reset. In the quiet town of Eldermere, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there was a peculiar tradition that had been passed down through generations. Every year on the night of the autumn equinox, the townsfolk would gather in the central square for the silent symphony. It was a mysterious event, shrouded in secrecy, where no music was played, no instruments were seen, and yet, everyone claimed to hear the most beautiful, haunting melodies. No one knew the origin of the tradition, but it was said that the symphony had the power to reveal hidden truths, to bring forth memories long forgotten, and to connect the living with the spirits of the dead. The townsfolk believed that the music came from another realm, a place where the boundaries between life and death were blurred. For as long as she could remember, Lila had been fascinated by the silent symphony. Her grandmother had told her stories of the event, describing it as a night when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. Lila had always been a curious child, with a deep love for music and a thirst for knowledge. She had spent years studying the history of Eldermere, trying to uncover the secrets of the silent symphony, but the answers always eluded her. This year, Lila was determined to experience the symphony for herself. She had just turned 18, and according to tradition, She was now old enough to attend the event. She had heard whispers that the symphony was not just a beautiful experience but also a dangerous one. Some claimed that those who listened too closely could lose themselves, their minds consumed by the music. But Lila was not afraid. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The night of the equinox arrived, and the town square was filled with people. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, with a full moon casting an eerie glow over the gathering. Lila stood at the edge of the square, her heart pounding with anticipation. She noticed that the townsfolk were unusually quiet, their faces solemn, as if they were preparing for something sacred. As the clock struck midnight, the square fell into complete silence. Lila held her breath, waiting for something to happen, and then she heard it. At first it was just a faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but as she listened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was music, but unlike anything she had ever heard before. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, filled with a sense of longing and sorrow. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very air around her was alive with sound. Lila closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She felt a strange sensation, as if the melodies were reaching into her mind, pulling at her memories. She saw flashes of her childhood, moments she had long forgotten. She saw her grandmother, smiling and holding her hand. She saw her parents, laughing and dancing in the kitchen. And then she saw something else, a dark, shadowy figure, standing at the edge of her vision. The music grew louder, more intense. Lila felt a surge of emotions, joy, sadness, fear, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. She opened her eyes and looked around the square. The townsfolk were all standing still, their eyes closed, their faces serene, but there was something strange about them. Their expressions were too still, too perfect, as if they were under a spell. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to leave, to run away from the square, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The music was pulling her in, deeper and deeper, and she couldn't resist. And then she heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the music like a knife. Lila, she turned around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time. Lila, come to me. She felt a strange pull, as if the voice was drawing her towards something. She took a step forward, then another, and soon she was walking through the square, towards the edge of town. The music followed her, growing louder and more intense with each step. She felt as if she was being guided by an unseen force, leading her towards something she couldn't see. She reached the edge of the forest and hesitated. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but the voice was coming from within.
Lila.
Don't be afraid. The old house on the edge of town had always been a source of fascination for the locals. It stood alone, surrounded by dense woods, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The windows were dark like empty eye sockets, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. No one had lived there for decades, and the stories about the house were enough to keep even the most curious children at bay. But for Emily, the house was an irresistible mystery. Emily had always been drawn to the macabre. She loved ghost stories, horror movies, and anything that sent a shiver down her spine. So when she heard about the old house, she knew she had to see it for herself. She had just moved to the small town for college, and the house seemed like the perfect way to spend a lonely Friday night. She packed a small bag with a flashlight, a notebook, and a camera, and set off on her bike just as the sun was beginning to set. The woods were thick and dark, and the air was filled with the sound of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As she approached the house, she felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a growing sense of unease. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Emily parked her bike at the edge of the property and approached the house on foot. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the path to the door was barely visible. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior of the house was even more decrepit than the outside. The floors were warped and covered in a thick layer of dust, and the walls were stained with water damage. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. Emily turned on her flashlight and began to explore. The first room she entered was the living room. The furniture was old and covered in sheets, and the fireplace was filled with ashes. She noticed that the walls were covered in strange markings, scratches, and symbols that seemed to have been carved into the wood. She took out her notebook and began to sketch the symbols, wondering what they could mean. As she moved through the house, she found more of the same, rooms filled with old decaying furniture and walls covered in strange markings. The further she went, the more uneasy she felt. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching her every move. She eventually found herself in the basement. The stairs creaked under her weight, and the air was even colder and damper than the rest of the house. The basement was filled with old boxes and broken furniture, but what caught her attention was the large, ornate mirror that stood against one wall. The mirror was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its frame was made of dark, twisted wood, and the glass was cloudy and cracked. But as she approached, she noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. Instead, it was the image of a young woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes with a look of terror on her face. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by her own reflection. She shook her head, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. She turned to leave the basement, but as she did, she heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that she almost didn't hear it, but it was unmistakable, a voice calling her name. Emily. She spun around, shining her flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, and she realized that it was coming from the mirror. Emily, help me. She took a step closer to the mirror, her curiosity overcoming her fear. The glass began to ripple like water, and the image of the young woman appeared again. This time she was reaching out, her hand pressed against the glass. Please, help me. Emily reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the glass. The moment she did, the room was filled with a blinding light, and she felt herself being pulled forward into the mirror. When the light faded, Emily found herself standing in a different room. It was the same house, but it looked as if it had been frozen in time. The furniture was new, the walls were clean, and the air was warm and inviting. But the feeling of dread was still there, stronger than ever. She turned around and saw the young woman from the mirror standing behind her. She was even more beautiful up close, with long, dark hair and piercing blue eyes. But there was something wrong. Her skin was pale and translucent, and her eyes were filled with a deep, unending sadness. Thank you for coming, the woman said, her voice soft and melodic. I've been waiting for someone like you for a long time. Who are you? Emily asked, her voice trembling. My name is Eleanor, the woman replied. I used to live in this house many years ago, but I was trapped here by something evil. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean, trapped? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. There's a presence in this house, something dark and malevolent. It feeds on fear and despair, and it won't let me leave. I've been trying to reach out to someone, anyone who could help me, and now you're here. Emily's mind was racing. She didn't know what to believe, but she couldn't deny the reality of what was happening. She was standing in a different time, talking to a ghost, and if Eleanor was telling the truth, then she was in grave danger.
What do you need me to do?
Emily asked. Eleanor reached out and took her hand. Her touch was cold like ice, but there was a strange comfort in it. You need to find the source of the evil, she said. It's hidden somewhere in the house. If you can destroy it, I'll be free, and you can go back to your own time. Emily nodded, though she had no idea how she was going to accomplish such a task, but she knew she had to try. She couldn't leave Eleanor trapped here, alone and afraid. The two of them began to search the house, room by room. The atmosphere grew heavier with each step, and Emily could feel the presence Eleanor had spoken of. It was like a shadow, lurking just out of sight, watching and waiting. As they moved through the house, Emily began to notice strange things, objects moving on their own, whispers in the darkness, and the feeling of being followed. But she pressed on, determined to help Eleanor. Finally, they reached the attic. The door was locked, but Eleanor waved her hand, and it creaked open. The attic was dark and filled with old, dusty boxes, but in the center of the room there was a small, ornate box, covered in the same strange symbols that Emily had seen on the walls. That's it, Eleanor whispered. That's the source. Emily approached the box, her heart pounding. She could feel the evil emanating from it, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She reached out and opened the box, revealing a small, blackened object, a human heart, dried and shriveled, but still beating faintly. Emily recoiled in horror, but Eleanor urged her on. You have to destroy it, she said. It's the only way. Emily took a deep breath and reached into the box. The moment she touched the heart, she felt a surge of energy, like an electric shock. The room was filled with a deafening roar, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around her like a storm.
What?
But she didn't let go. She squeezed the heart with all her strength, feeling it crumble to dust in her hand. The roar grew louder, and the shadows closed in, but then suddenly, everything went silent. The attic was still, and the air was clear. The heart was gone, and the evil presence with it. Eleanor let out a sigh of relief, and for the first time she smiled. "Thank you," she said. "You've set me free." Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had done it. She had destroyed the source of the evil, and now Eleanor could move on. But as she looked at Eleanor, she noticed that the woman's form was beginning to fade. "Wait," Emily said. "What about me? How do I get back?" Eleanor's smile was sad. "You'll find your way," she said. "Just follow the light." And with that, she was gone, leaving Emily alone in the attic. Emily turned and saw a faint light coming from the doorway. She followed it, descending the stairs and moving through the house. As she went, the house began to change, the walls crumbling and the furniture decaying until she was back in the present. She stumbled out of the house, gasping for breath, and collapsed on the front porch. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the woods. She had no idea how long she had been in the house, but it felt like an eternity. As she sat there trying to process everything that had happened, she noticed something in her hand, a small silver locket. She opened it and saw a picture of Eleanor, smiling and happy. On the back was an inscription, "Thank you, Emily, you saved me." Emily smiled, though her heart was still heavy. She had done something incredible, something she would never forget. But as she looked back at the house, she knew that she would never return. The old house on the edge of town had given up its secret, but it still held a darkness that she could never fully understand. She got on her bike and rode back to town, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. She knew that she would never be the same, but she also knew that she had done the right thing, and as she rode, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that Eleanor was finally free. But as she disappeared into the distance, the old house stood silent and still, its dark windows watching her go, and deep within its walls, something stirred, waiting for the next curious soul to enter its domain. The forgotten library, in the heart of the bustling city, hidden among the towering skyscrapers and busy streets, there was a library that no one seemed to know. It was an old ivy-covered building, its stone facade weathered by time. The sign above the door read the Athenaeum of Forgotten Knowledge, but most people passed by without a second glance. It was as if the library existed in a different dimension, invisible to those who weren't meant to find it. For as long as she could remember, Clara had been drawn to books. She loved the smell of old paper, the feel of a well-worn spine in her hands, and the way stories could transport her to different worlds. She had heard whispers of the Athenaeum from an elderly bookseller who claimed to have visited it once, many years ago. The bookseller had described it as a place where the rarest and most mysterious books were kept, books that contained knowledge lost to the world. Clara had spent months searching for the library, following cryptic clues and vague directions, and then, one rainy afternoon, she found it. The door creaked open as she pushed it, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding with excitement. The interior of the library was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves, filled with books of every size and color. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, and the only sound was the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. A spiral staircase led up to a balcony that overlooked the main room, and beyond that, more shelves stretched into the shadows. Clara wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of the books. Some of the titles were in languages she didn't recognize, and others had no title at all.
The price of perfection. In the not-so-distant future, humanity had achieved what once seemed impossible, the eradication of imperfection. Genetic engineering had advanced to the point where parents could design their children before birth, selecting for intelligence, physical beauty, and even personality traits. Diseases were a thing of the past, and the average human lifespan had stretched to well over a century. It was a utopia, or so it seemed. But perfection comes at a cost. Dr. Evelyn Hart had been one of the pioneers of genetic engineering. Her work had revolutionized the field, making her a household name and a hero to millions. But as the years passed, she began to have doubts. She had always believed that science could make the world a better place, but she hadn't anticipated the consequences of playing God. It started with the whispers. At first, Evelyn dismissed them as the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. But as the stories grew more frequent, more detailed, she couldn't ignore them any longer. People were disappearing. Children, mostly. They were the ones who had been engineered to be perfect, the ones who were supposed to be the future of humanity, and yet they were vanishing without a trace. Evelyn tried to convince herself that it was just a coincidence, that there was no connection between the disappearances and her work, but deep down she knew better. She had always known that there would be a price to pay for tampering with nature. She just hadn't expected it to be so high. The first time Evelyn saw the child, she thought she was hallucinating. She had been working late in her lab, poring over data in an attempt to distract herself from the growing sense of unease that had taken root in her mind. The lab was quiet, the only sound the hum of the machines that lined the walls, and then out of the corner of her eye she saw movement. She turned, her heart skipping a beat, and there he was, a boy no more than 10 years old, standing in the shadows. He was beautiful, with flawless skin and piercing blue eyes, but there was something wrong with him, something off. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the boy stepped into the light. His movements were too smooth, too precise, as if he had been programmed rather than born, and his eyes, they were empty, devoid of any emotion. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. The boy tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I am the future," he said, his voice cold and mechanical, "and you are the past." Before Evelyn could respond, the boy turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. The next morning, Evelyn went to the authorities. She told them about the boy, about the disappearances, about her fears that something had gone terribly wrong, but they didn't believe her. They dismissed her concerns as the paranoid ramblings of an aging scientist, a woman who had spent too much time in the lab and not enough in the real world. Frustrated and desperate, Evelyn decided to take matters into her own hands. She began to investigate the disappearances, digging through records and interviewing the families of the missing children. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. The children who had disappeared were all perfect, genetically engineered to be smarter, stronger, and more beautiful than anyone else. But they were also different. They didn't laugh or cry like other children. They didn't form attachments or show empathy. They were empty. And then there were the rumors, whispers of a secret facility, hidden deep in the mountains, where the perfect children were taken. No one knew what happened to them there. But those who had tried to find out had never returned. Evelyn knew she had to see for herself. The journey to the facility was long and arduous. Evelyn drove for hours through winding mountain roads, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The closer she got, the more her unease grew. The landscape was barren, devoid of life, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Finally, she reached the facility. It was a massive, imposing structure, its walls made of cold, gray concrete. There were no windows, no signs of life, just a single heavy door that seemed to dare her to enter. Evelyn took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was just as cold and sterile as the outside. The walls were lined with monitors, each one displaying a different room. Evelyn's heart sank as she realized what she was looking at. The rooms were filled with children. They were all perfect, just like the boys she had seen in her lab. But they weren't playing or laughing. They were sitting perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the walls in front of them. And then, as if on cue, they all turned to look at her. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the children began to move. They stood in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized, and began to walk toward her. Their eyes were empty, their faces expressionless, and yet there was something in their gaze that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here," one of the children said, his voice cold and mechanical. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you?" she whispered. The children stopped, their heads tilting in unison. "We are the future," they said, their voices blending together into a single haunting chorus. "And you are the past." Evelyn turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the sterile hallway. She didn't look back, didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for breath in the cold mountain air. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, the children standing at the edge of the facility, their empty eyes fixed on her. And then they were gone. Evelyn tried to warn people, to tell them what she had seen, but no one would listen. They were too enamored with the idea of perfection, too blinded by the promise of a better future to see the darkness that lay beneath. And so the disappearances continued. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, powerless to stop what she had helped create. She had always believed that science could make the world a better place, but now she knew the truth. Perfection comes at a cost, and the cost is humanity. In the quiet village of Hollowbrook, nestled deep within a dense ancient forest, there was a garden that no one dared to enter. It was known as the Garden of Shadows, a place where the flowers were said to bloom in colors that no human eye had ever seen. and where the air was always thick with the scent of something sweet and intoxicating. The garden was surrounded by a high ivy-covered wall, and the iron gate that led inside was always locked, its key held by the village elder, a reclusive man named Silas. The villagers spoke of the garden in hushed tones, their voices filled with a mixture of awe and fear. They said that the garden was a place of great beauty, but also of great danger. Those who entered never returned, their souls claimed by the shadows that lurked within. But despite the warnings, there were always those who were drawn to the garden, their curiosity overpowering their fear. One such person was a young woman named Elara. She had always been fascinated by the stories of the Garden of Shadows, and she had spent years studying the history of Hollowbrook, trying to uncover the secrets of the garden. She had heard whispers that the garden was not just a place of danger, but also a place of great power, a place where one could gain knowledge and abilities beyond imagination. Elara had just turned 21, and she was determined to see the garden for herself. She had spent months planning her journey, gathering supplies and studying the old maps of the village, and then, one moonless night, she set out, her heart pounding with anticipation. The path to the garden was overgrown and difficult to navigate, but Elara pressed on, her determination unwavering. As she approached the garden, she felt a strange sensation, as if the air around her was alive with energy. The gate loomed ahead, its iron bars twisted and rusted, but still strong. Elara took a deep breath and reached into her bag, pulling out the key she had stolen from Silas. She inserted it into the lock and turned it, the sound of the mechanism clicking open echoing in the silence. The gate creaked open, and Elara stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The garden was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The flowers were indeed unlike anything she had ever seen, their petals shimmering with colors that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet and intoxicating, and the ground was covered in a soft, mossy carpet. But as she walked deeper into the garden, she began to notice something strange. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting as if they were alive. The air grew colder, and the scent of the flowers became overpowering, almost suffocating. Elara felt a surge of unease, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the secrets of the garden. She reached the center of the garden, where a large ancient tree stood, its branches twisted and gnarled. At the base of the tree was a small stone altar, covered in moss and ivy. As she approached the altar, she noticed something strange. The shadows around her seemed to be gathering, forming into shapes that were almost human. She felt a chill run down her spine, but she couldn't look away. And then she heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Elara. She turned around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time. Elara, come to me. She felt a strange pull, as if the voice was drawing her towards the altar. She took a step forward, then another, and soon she was standing in front of the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows around her began to shift and twist, forming into the shape of a man. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and piercing black eyes. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, and he carried a cane with a silver handle. "Who are you?" Elara asked, her voice trembling. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I am the keeper of the garden," he said. "And you, Elara, have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Elara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The keeper's smile widened. "The Garden of Shadows is more than just a place of beauty. It is a gateway, a bridge between worlds. Those who enter can gain great power, but they must be willing to pay the price." Elara felt a surge of fear. "What price?" The keeper's eyes gleamed with a strange light. "The price is your soul. Once you enter the garden, you can never leave. Your soul will be bound to the shadows, and you will become one of them." Elara shook her head, backing away. "No, I don't want that. I want to go home." The keeper's smile widened. "It's too late for that. The garden has already claimed you. You can feel it, can't you? The shadows, the power, they are calling to you." Elara covered her ears, but the voice was inside her head, impossible to block out. She felt a surge of panic, but it was too late. The keeper reached out and touched her forehead, and everything went black. When Elara opened her eyes, she was in a different place. The garden was gone, replaced by a vast, endless landscape of shadows. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet and intoxicating, and the ground was covered in a soft, mossy carpet. She looked around and saw figures in the distance, shadows moving through the darkness.
They were the lost souls, the ones who had been claimed by the garden, wandering aimlessly, their faces filled with sorrow. Elara felt a surge of despair. She knew that she was trapped, that she had crossed into the realm of the shadows. She wanted to scream, to cry, but no sound came out. And then she heard the voice again. Elara. She turned around and saw her mother, standing a few feet away. She looked just as Elara remembered her, with her kind eyes and gentle smile. "Mom," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. Her mother nodded. "I'm here, my dear."
But you shouldn't be.
"This is not your place." Elara felt tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to get back. I'm trapped." Her mother reached out and took her hand. "You must listen to the shadows, Elara. They will guide you, but you must be strong. The realm of the shadows is a dangerous place, and it will try to keep you here." Elara nodded, clutching her mother's hand. "I'll try." Her mother smiled. "I know you will. Now go, follow the shadows and don't look back." Elara took a deep breath and let go of her mother's hand. She turned and began to walk, following the faint shadows that echoed through the desolate landscape. The lost souls reached out to her, their voices whispering in her ears, but she kept her eyes forward, focusing on the shadows. The journey was long and arduous, but eventually, she saw a light in the distance. It was faint, but it grew brighter as she approached. The shadows grew louder, more intense, and she felt a surge of hope. And then she was back in the garden, standing in front of the altar. The keeper was gone, and the shadows had faded. Elara felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, and she collapsed to the ground. When she woke up, she was back in the village. The garden was gone, and the air was clear. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the village. Elara sat up, her mind reeling. She wasn't sure if what she had experienced was real, or just a dream, but she knew that she had been changed. The shadows were still in her head, faint, but persistent, a reminder of the realm she had visited. She got to her feet and began to walk home, her heart heavy with the knowledge she had gained. The Garden of Shadows was not just a place of beauty, it was a dangerous one, a gateway to a realm that no one should enter. But as she walked, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be able to resist the call of the shadows, if she would ever be able to forget the haunting beauty that had touched her soul. And deep within the Garden of Shadows, the keeper watched her go, a smile playing on his lips. The garden would continue to grow, and the realm of the shadows would always be waiting, ready to claim its next victim. In the heart of the city, hidden behind an unmarked door in an alley that smelled of damp concrete and forgotten dreams, there was a place where the wealthy and powerful gathered. It was not a place one could find on a map or through an invitation. You had to know it existed, and even then, you had to be deemed worthy to enter. It was called the Silent Auction, and it was not like any auction house you had ever heard of. The rules were simple: no names, no faces, no questions. The bidders wore masks, elegant, grotesque, or utterly plain, to conceal their identities. The items up for bid were never displayed. Instead, they were described in cryptic, tantalizing terms by a faceless auctioneer who stood at the front of the room, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. But the most important rule was this: once you placed a bid, there was no backing out. The price you paid was not always money. Sometimes it was something far more valuable. Elliot Graves had heard whispers of the silent auction for years. He was a man who prided himself on knowing the city's secrets, on having access to things others could only dream of. But this was different. This was the kind of secret that could ruin a person, or elevate them to unimaginable heights, and Elliot was willing to risk it. He had been given a single clue: find the door with no handle, and knock 3 times. It had taken him weeks to locate it, but when he did, he felt a thrill of anticipation. The door was unremarkable, tucked into the side of an old brick building that looked like it hadn't been. He knocked 3 times, and the door swung open on silent hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense, and something else, something metallic lit. The walls lined with velvet curtains that seemed to absorb the light. A dozen or so people sat in high-backed chairs, their faces obscured by masks. Elliot was handed a plain black mask and gestured to an empty seat. He sat down, his heart pounding, and his ear stepped forward, his face hidden in shadow. He began to speak, his voice low and smooth, like the purr of a cat. "Our first item tonight," he said, "is a rare opportunity, a chance to undo a single regret, to go back and make a different choice. The bidding starts at 1 year." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. A year? What did that mean? He glanced around the room. but the other bidders were impassive, their masks giving nothing away. One of them raised a hand, and the auctioneer nodded. 1 year, he said. Do I hear 2? Another hand. Do I hear 3? Elliot's mind raced. He had regrets. Who didn't? But was this real? Could it be real? Before he could stop himself, he raised his hand. 3 years, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 4? The bidding continued, climbing higher and higher, until it reached 10 years. The room fell silent, and the auctioneer turned to Elliot. 10 years, he said. Sold. Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. What had he just agreed to? He wanted to ask, but the rules were no questions. He was led to a small curtained alcove, where a contract waited on a table. The terms were written in elegant script, but the language was vague. He hesitated, but the thrill of the unwind was too much to resist. He signed the contract. The auctioneer handed him a small, ornate key. Use it wisely, he said. The key was cold in Elliot's hand. As he left the auction house, he had no idea what it unlocked, or how it would help him undo a regret. But as he walked through the city, his mind began to wander. He thought about the choices he had made, the paths he hadn't taken, and then it hit him. The key was for his childhood home. He hadn't been back in years, not since his mother's death. She had begged him to visit her in the hospital, but he had been too busy, too caught up in his own life. By the time he finally went, it was too late. She was gone. Elliot's hands trembled as he inserted the key into the lock of his old front door. It turned with a soft click, and the door swung open. Inside, the house was exactly as he remembered it. The faded wallpaper, the worn furniture, the faint scent of his mother's perfume. And there, sitting in her favorite chair, was his mother. She looked just as she had the last time he had seen her. Her face lined with age, but her eyes bright and full of life. She smiled when she saw him, and for a moment, Elliot felt a surge of joy. But then he noticed something strange. The room was silent, completely silent. No ticking clock, no creaking floorboards, no sound of his own breathing. It was as if the world had been muted. Elliot, his mother said, her voice soft and distant. You came back. He wanted to respond, to tell her how sorry he was, but the words wouldn't come. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, sluggish, and then he noticed something else. His hands were wrinkled, the skin thin and papery. He looked down at himself, and saw that his clothes were loose, hanging off a frame that had grown frail with age. He stumbled to a mirror on the wall, and gasped. The face staring back at him was his own, but older, much older. His hair was gray, his face lined with deep wrinkles. He looked like a man in his 70s, not the 40-year-old he had been just moments ago. What happened? He croaked, his voice weak and raspy. His mother's smile faded. You paid the price, she said. 10 years, Elliot. That's what it cost to see me again. Elliot's heart sank. He had thought the auctioneer meant 10 years of his life in some abstract sense, not literally. He had traded a decade of his life for this, for a few moments with a ghost. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. His mother reached out and took his hand. Her touch was cold like ice. It's too late for apologies, she said. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. The room began to fade, the walls dissolving into darkness. Elliot tried to hold on, but the world slipped away from him. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the auction house, sitting in the same chair as before. The auctioneer was speaking, his voice low and hypnotic. Our next item, he said, is a chance to relive your happiest memory. The bidding starts at 5 years. Elliot's hands trembled as he raised them to his face. His skin was smooth, unlined. He was young again, but he could still feel the weight of those lost years, the emptiness they had left behind. He stood up and walked out of the auction house, the whispers of the other bidders following him into the night. He didn't look back. He knew better now. The silent auction was not a place for second chances. It was a place for fools who thought they could outsmart fate. And Elliot had learned the hard way that some prices were too high to pay. The city that never sleeps, but stood beneath the glittering skyline of Nova Obscura, a city that thrived on ambition and excess. There was a secret, a dark pulsating secret that few knew, and even fewer dared to speak of. The city was alive, not in the metaphorical sense, as poets and dreamers might describe it, but in a very literal, very terrifying way. Nova Obscura was a marvel of modern engineering, a sprawling metropolis of glass and steel that stretched as far as the eye could see. Its streets were a labyrinth of neon lights and towering skyscrapers, its air thick with the hum of electricity and the scent of ambition. But beneath the surface, beneath the layers of asphalt and concrete, something stirred. It began with the tremors. At first they were small, almost imperceptible, a slight vibration in the ground, a faint rumbling that could easily be mistaken for a passing subway train. But as the days passed, the tremors grew stronger, buildings swayed, windows shattered, and the people of Nova Obscura began to panic. The city's officials were quick to dismiss the tremors as a natural phenomenon, the result of shifting tectonic plates. But there were those who knew better, those who had heard the whispers. Among them was Lila Vance, a journalist with a knack for uncovering the truth. She had been investigating the tremors for weeks, digging through old records and interviewing anyone who might have information. What she found was both fascinating and horrifying. Nova Obscura had been built on the ruins of an ancient city, a place that had been abandoned centuries ago for reasons no one could remember. The old city had been buried, its secrets lost to time, but now it seemed those secrets were coming to light. Lila's investigation led her to a man named Elias Crane, a reclusive historian who had spent his life studying the ancient city. He was reluctant to speak at first, but when Lila showed him the evidence she had gathered, his demeanor changed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "The city, it's not just built on the ruins, it's built on them." Lila frowned. Then Elias hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather-bound journal. He handed it to Lila, his hands shaking. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said. "He was one of the architects who designed Nova Obscura. He knew the truth, but he was sworn to secrecy. He only wrote it down because he couldn't bear to take it to his grave." Lila opened the journal and began to read. The pages were filled with sketches and notes, all detailing the same thing, a massive ancient creature that lay buried beneath the city. It was unlike anything Lila had ever seen, a monstrous serpentine being with eyes like molten gold, and a body that seemed to stretch on forever. "They called it the Leviathan," Elias said. "It's been here for thousands of years, sleeping beneath the earth. The ancient city was built to contain it, to keep it from waking. But when Nova Obscura was built, they disturbed it. And now it's waking up." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. "What happens if it wakes up?" Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with fear. "It will destroy the city, and everyone in it." The tremors grew worse. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated as buildings began to collapse. The streets were filled with the sound of sirens and the cries of the desperate. But Lila knew that evacuation wouldn't be enough. If the Leviathan woke, there would be no escape. She tried to warn the city's officials, but they refused to listen. They were too focused on maintaining order, on keeping the people calm. And so Lila took matters into her own hands. She gathered a team of engineers and scientists, people who were willing to risk everything to stop the Leviathan. Together they devised a plan. They would drill into the earth and inject a powerful sedative into the creature, putting it back to sleep. It was a desperate plan, and the odds of success were slim, but it was the only chance they had. The drilling began at midnight. The team worked in silence, their faces grim, as they descended into the depths of the earth. The air grew hotter, the deeper they went, and the ground beneath their feet trembled with the creature's movements. Finally they reached it. The Leviathan was even more massive than Lila had imagined. Its body was coiled like a spring, its scales glistening in the dim light. Its eyes were closed, but Lila could feel the power radiating from it, a primal force that made her bones ache. The team worked quickly, setting up the equipment and preparing the sedative. But just as they were about to inject it, the Leviathan's eyes snapped open. Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat. The creature's eyes were like twin suns, burning with an ancient malevolent intelligence. It let out a roar that shook the earth, and the team scrambled to retreat. But it was too late. The Leviathan surged forward, its massive body tearing through the earth like paper. The team was thrown aside like rag dolls, their screams drowned out by the creature's roar. Lila managed to cling to a piece of machinery, her heart pounding as she watched the Leviathan rise. It was free. The city above was chaos. The Leviathan's emergence had caused massive destruction. Entire blocks reduced to rubble in an instant. The streets were filled with panicked crowds, their screams echoing through the night. Lila emerged from the depths, her body battered and bruised. She looked up at the Leviathan, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was a force of nature, an unstoppable force of destruction. But Lila wasn't ready to give up. She rallied the survivors, urging them to fight back. Together they used whatever they could find. Cars, debris, even pieces of the Leviathan's own body, to attack the creature. It was a desperate, futile effort, but they had no other choice. In the end, it was the sedative that saved them. One of the engineers had managed to inject it into the Leviathan before it broke free. The creature's movements began to slow, its roars growing weaker. Finally, with a shuddering sigh, it collapsed, its massive body sinking back into the